What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you for joining me. This is episode 31 of Hockey on the Spot, and continuing with the 30 teams in 30 days for the entire month of August. Coming down to the final stretch here, only two teams to go, and they are quite arguably the two most important teams in the National Hockey League as far as regular season standards are concerned, because they are the two teams that possess the most coveted players in the entire National Hockey League. The two most coveted players in the National Hockey League, Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin. So for today, we're going to talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins. And they have one of the two top players in the National Hockey League. Number 87, Sidney Crosby, former first overall pick from 2005. He was signed to a long-term deal last off-season, 13-year contract extension. And before we get into anything else, I just want to talk about that contract real quick. I don't like that contract at all, considering his problems with injuries. And it really showed again this year. After having concussion problems the past couple of years, he got hurt again this season, missing the last quarter of the season due to a shoulder injury. So this is a player who, despite how good and consistent he is when healthy, can never seem to stay healthy. So the contract is bad. And that's basically what the Pittsburgh Penguins offseason was about this year, retaining their guys and signing them to long-term deals. But before we get into that, let's talk about their 2012-2013 lockout-shortened season as a whole. Through 48 games, they went 36-12-0, meaning they went undefeated in both overtime and a shootout for 72 points. First in the Eastern Conference, second overall in the league. Only the Chicago Blackhawks finished with a better record than the Pittsburgh Penguins this past season. They had 77 points, 5 more than the Pens did. And the Penguins, though, during the regular season were absolutely fantastic, especially in the month of March. They went undefeated for the entire month of March, and that also includes the last game of the month, which was the day after the trade deadline. The trade deadline, the Pittsburgh Penguins really bulked up their roster and had what looked to be an all-star team. They got Jerome McGinley from the Calgary Flames. They got Douglas Murray from the San Jose Sharks. They got Brendan Morrow from the Dallas Stars. And they got UC Jokinen from the Carolina Hurricanes. They looked like an all-star team with that roster. Of course, until Crosby got hurt, which did happen the day after the trade deadline, and he did not return until the playoffs. But once the playoffs came around, the Pens looked like a team that was ready to win it all. And though it didn't show right away, they were pretty consistent in the playoffs for the most part, except for the very beginning and the very end. In the very beginning, they had a close call series with the 8th-seeded New York Islanders, a series in which the Islanders stayed with them toe-to-toe until Marc-Andre Fleury was relieved of duty for almost the remainder of the playoffs, and Thomas Vokoun would get the start in net. Once Thomas Vokoun got the start in net, the Penguins took off and went on to win the series in 6 games. The next round, probably the easiest series for the Pittsburgh Penguins, they went up against the 7th-seeded Ottawa Senators, who were coming off a 5-game upset against the Montreal Canadiens. The Pittsburgh Penguins defeated them in 5 games. And then, in the next round after that, the Eastern Conference Finals, they take on the 4th-seeded Boston Bruins, a series in which the Pens expected to win with ease because of Boston's lack of offense. Well, not only were their words not backed up, but Boston's defense limited the Pittsburgh offense to just 2 goals. And though the Penguins did dominate the series as in shots on goal, it didn't change the fact that their season ended in disappointment, and it would be Boston going to the Stanley Cup Finals instead of them. Because when you really, and it really comes as a big shock, because when you really look at that roster on paper from after the trade deadline, that's pretty much an all-star team with considering who they got. Now the majority of these guys are gone, and 3 out of the 4 trade deadline acquisitions basically proved to be rental players. And they were the big trade acquisitions: Brendan Morrow, Douglas Murray, and Jerome McGinley. Jussi Jokinen is still with the team and should see more of a full-time role this year, unlike last year, as a third-line player. Brendan Morrow is still unsigned, as are Mark Eaton and Warren Peters, who is an AHL player. None of these 3 guys will be back. Now, the Penguins did lose a lot of guys this offseason, though. They absolutely lost a lot of guys this offseason because, again, they spent most of the offseason re-signing their own guys. Following Sidney Crosby's long-term contract from a year ago, they gave long-term 8-year extensions to both Evgeny Malkin and Chris Letang. They gave 4-year extensions to Chris Kunitz and Pascal Dupuis. And they gave a 1-year extension to Craig Adams, who they feel is one of their more valuable fourth-line players. So they made a lot of re-signings this year, and they also added a new assistant coach very recently. Jacques Martin, former head coach of the Montreal Canadiens and Florida Panthers, a defense-minded coach, and he'll be expected to help the Penguins' defense a little bit and mix with Dan Bylsma's offensive system. Dan Bylsma was also re-signed. He was re-signed to a 2-year extension after many rumors revolved around him getting fired. But because of all these re-signings and because of how close to the cap they were, it made for a very inactive offseason as far as actual additions, and it also made for a bunch of subtractions. Starting with some players who either played in the AHL or played very few games in the NHL. Players like Trevor Smith, Philip Dupuis, Chad Kolarik, Dylan Reese, and Brad Thiessen. All these guys are gone, and only one of them is actually signed with an NHL team, and that is Trevor Smith, who signed with the Toronto Maple Leafs. The other 4 are still unsigned but will not be back. Everyone else, Alex Grant, defenseman, he was dealt to the Anaheim Ducks in a minor deal, in which the Penguins would acquire forward Harry Zolnarchuk. He'll be a good AHL player for them. Every other subtraction, though, was pretty big in its own way. They traded Tyler Kennedy to the San Jose Sharks to clear up some cap space. They'll miss him and miss his depth on the third line. Douglas Murray, who looked like at one point was going to sign with the Vancouver Canucks, ended up signing with the Montreal Canadiens. Jerome McGinley, he almost immediately went on to sign with the same team he was originally going to be traded to before deciding to change his mind at the last minute and go to the Pens, the Boston Bruins. This time going to the Bruins is for real. He signed a 1-year deal there. So kind of a decent loss for the Penguins as they lose the guy who they believe to be Sidney Crosby's protector. And probably the biggest loss of them all, considering this was the only one that really wasn't intended, Matt Cook. Matt Cook really provided depth for this team, and they really did want to bring him back. But they knew with all the contract extensions that they were doing, as well as the future consideration of having to maybe give James Neal a contract extension at some point, there was no room in the roster for Matt Cook. He went on to sign with the Minnesota Wild. So one of the league's most hated players now goes to the Minnesota Wild. So a lot of losses this offseason for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And we mentioned Mark Eaton and Brendan Morrow are both still on the unrestricted free agent board, as is AHL center Warren Peters. But none of those guys will be back. And though the Penguins didn't have many additions, they did have a few. Nothing major, though. More moves for the AHL. Players like Nick Drasnovich, who they brought in from the Columbus Blue Jackets, he'll play in the American Hockey League. Right winger Chris Connor, who they brought in from the Phoenix Coyotes, he could see call-ups at points in the season, but will most likely spend most of his time in the American Hockey League. They brought in centerman Andrew Ebbett, coming over from the Vancouver Canucks. He's another depth player and a guy who, at points, like Chris Connor, at points could see himself getting called up, but should see most time in the American Hockey League. The Penguins, though, had two actual additions of players that would most definitely be in their roster and full time. First, they brought in right winger Matt D'Agostini, who's coming over from the New Jersey Devils. When he was dealt to the New Jersey Devils from the St. Louis Blues last year, despite the rough year in New Jersey, Matt D'Agostini was a serious upside. He turned out to be one of their better depth players. He's a solid defensive player and a guy who can score big goals in big situations. He'll figure to add nicely to a third line that just recently lost Tyler Kennedy and Matt Cook. And the big addition for the Pittsburgh Penguins this offseason, their biggest signing this year, more of a re-signing in its own right. Rob Scuderi has returned to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He won the Stanley Cup with them in 2009 and has spent the past 4 seasons as a member of the Los Angeles Kings. Not that he didn't benefit from his time in Los Angeles. He absolutely did, and was a big part of their cup run in 2012. Rob Scuderi would win the cup with the Los Angeles Kings in 2012 and also help them go to the Western Conference Finals last year, where they lost in 5 games to the Chicago Blackhawks, who eventually won the Stanley Cup. Rob Scuderi now has returned to the Pittsburgh Penguins, signing with them to a 4-year contract. And I think it's a great addition. He, in all due respect, did not want to leave Pittsburgh. And though he did benefit well from his time in Los Angeles, he really did not want to leave Pittsburgh. And though he's not getting any younger, he's 34 years of age, he's still a good player and known for being one of the better shutdown defensemen in the game, and he'll figure to add on nicely to the Penguins' top 4. He'll definitely alleviate some pressure off of Brooks Orpik and really help them out with defensive responsibilities. He also is good with possessing the puck, from what I've noticed. So, a very good signing for the Pittsburgh Penguins for a former fan favorite, a guy that they are absolutely happy to have back in their lineup. Which brings us to a couple of the questions for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Who is going to be the 6th top 6 forward? We already know 5 of them. Sidney Crosby, Pascal Dupuis, and Chris Kunitz will go back to being the top line, now with Jarome Iginla gone. Yes, with Jarome Iginla gone, Pascal Dupuis will move back to the top line. And on the second line, they'll have Evgeny Malkin and James Neal. But who's going to play on the wing with those two? A lot of people figure that it would be former first-round draft pick Bo Bennett that would play on the line with them. And that wouldn't surprise me. Bo Bennett is a guy who's now entering his sophomore year, and he'll see a much bigger role this year now with Morrow, Iginla, and Cook and Kennedy all gone. He should see time on that second line. The main question for the Pittsburgh Penguins is, what is their bottom 6 going to look like now without Kennedy, Cook, and Morrow, specifically, and with Pascal Dupuis moving back up to the top line? Again, they added Matt D'Agostini this offseason from the New Jersey Devils. He'll figure to play on that third line, and Brandon Sutter will figure to be their third line center. Jussi Jokinen is probably the biggest possibility to play as their third line left winger. This is a guy who can definitely provide some offense for them. The real question, though, is the fourth line. They have 4 guys that are definitely potential. for the fourth line. Joe Vitale, Craig Adams, Tanner Glass, and Dustin Jeffrey. Which one is going to be the 13th forward, and which one is going to play? Which ones are going to play? Right now, people are saying most likely Dustin Jeffrey will be the 13th forward, but I have my doubts about that. I absolutely have my doubts. Tanner Glass is a possibility, and so is Joe Vitale. If they move Craig Adams from wing to center, he can play both. What's their defense going to be like now with Jacques Martin on board? Is it going to be better? We definitely know Rob Scuderi is probably going to play with a healthy Chris Letang. Paul Martin will probably play with Brooks Orpik, and they also got Matt Niskanen. But who plays with him? Is it going to be Simon Dupre, which would probably be the most likely candidate? Or maybe will it be a guy like Derek Engelland, who's had experience playing as a physical shutdown defenseman in their lineup? Will it be Robert Bortuzzo, who is definitely another possibility? Or maybe do they bring up a guy like Oli Mata or Derek Pouliot, who both have bright futures in this league? Or maybe even to a lesser extent, a guy like Scott Harrington or Brian Dumoulin, the other guy who they acquired in the Jordan Staal trade from the Carolina Hurricanes. So the Pens do have a lot of options as far as what their lines look like and defense pairs. But probably the biggest question will be in goal. Marc-Andre Fleury is most likely going to be the starter for this season. Despite how poorly he played in the playoffs, he will be back in the starting position at least for opening night. But how will he hold out? Thomas Vokoun is still their backup goaltender. Does he take his place at some point? That'll be interesting to see. I think Fleury will stay in net for the regular season. Always good in the regular season. It's really in the playoffs where it comes to count. And Fleury needs to be better in the playoffs. He really does. Now, let's take a look at the top 10 prospects for the Pittsburgh Penguins. In my opinion, I like this prospect pool. I didn't think it was as impressive at first, but I've grown to like it. But I still think there are a few prospect pools that's deeper. I think it's deeper than the New York Rangers, and it's deeper than the Carolina Hurricanes. But the Columbus Blue Jackets, the New Jersey Devils, and the Philadelphia Flyers are all deeper than the Pittsburgh Penguins. But they do have some good prospects on here, particularly defensemen. Defense is the call for this top 10 prospect list. Oli Mata is number 1. Derek Pouliot's number 2. Scott Harrington's number 3. Brian Dumoulin's number 4. And they also have some other players on there like Tristan Jarry, a goaltender. And then they have 5 forwards in their bottom 5. But the prospect on this list that catches my eye more than anybody is their number 2 prospect, defenseman Derek Pouliot. Derek Pouliot was the 8th overall pick in the 2012 NHL entry draft and has been a superstar for the Portland Winterhawks of the Western Hockey League. 13 goals and 65 points in 65 regular season and playoff games last year. Was a big part of their run to winning the WHL championship and their run to the Memorial Cup. So I think he's definitely their future on the blue line as far as offensive defensemen go. Oli Mata is good, but I personally think that Derek Pouliot is better. That's just my personal opinion. Now, the player on this Pittsburgh roster that needs to be better this year in order for the Pens to be a formidable force this year, no question, has to be Marc-Andre Fleury. Marc-Andre Fleury was not good in the playoffs. He was fine during the regular season. But if the Penguins are going to have a chance at winning the Cup this year, Fleury needs to be better, particularly in the playoffs. Overall, are the Penguins a playoff team? Absolutely. They are stacked as far as their top 6 goes and their defense. Are they a Stanley Cup winning team? That's the real question. I do believe they'll finish first in the East, and I do believe they'll make the playoffs. But I don't think they're going to win the Stanley Cup. I don't trust the goaltending situation right now. Okay, guys, that'll do it for episode 31 of Hockey on the Spot. Join me again tomorrow when we conclude our Metropolitan Division Tour, our Eastern Conference Tour, and most importantly, our 30 teams in 30 days with the Washington Capitals. So until then, this has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Join me again tomorrow. Have a great day.